Hey everybody, welcome back to the fish tank. Do you know what time it is? It's time. That's right, Minion Masters meta. It's our monthly chance to have a look at the meta that's going on out there and reflect on it and potentially follow it along or build against it. Now, one thing to mention, we are in Vanguard 1.49. We're a couple of weeks into the season, so we've got a decent amount of leaderboard data to have a look at. There was a hotfix 7 or so days into the season that addressed numerous things, and that may affect some of the stats we're seeing. Now, specifically, that hotfix fixed a bugged APEP, where APEP's perks were giving spells when they shouldn't have done, and also incorrect reductions, so APEP was potentially being played less because of the bugs there. And of course, Shroomama Shumi, which has been on everyone's lips this season, did get a bit of a nerf in that hotfix as well. So I'll draw attention to that as we go through. And now what we're also going to do in this one that we haven't done before is we're going to extrapolate the data and look at a little bit more than we had previously. Now, because of that, I don't want the video to get too long. So to include that extra stuff, what I'm going to probably do is skip over some of the less interesting things or things that haven't really changed too much as we go through. But of course, you can always pause the video, revisit it, have a look at the slides, screenshot it, whatever you want to do to grab the information that is most useful to you. But anyway, enough preamble. Let's get into the meat and vegetables. Okay, so version 1.49. Let's have a look at our master popularity. Start off with 1v1. We got the two graphs there, 1.48 last season on the left and 1.49 this season on the right. Now, a few things to note. APEP, the kind of the bluest of the blues on there, has dropped down quite substantially. And that's likely to do with the fact that he was bugged early season. Now, his play rate has increased since the hotfix, but still nowhere near what it was like last season. We can see Morellia's had a bit of an uptick as well. VOLCO's had a big uptick, up 10% from last season to basically the joint first place master. And I think that's a lot to do with the Shroomama meta. VOLCO giving you those buffs from his perks is a real sort of freebie for the shrooms to split on. Also, MORDAR has had a decent sized increase in play rate there, and again, quite possibly due to the Shroomamas. Remember, if you do play the shrooms with MORDAR, if you split even the tiniest of Shroomamas, it will res as a full fat one. So nice little tip there. So things have changed at the top a little bit with regards to APEP, but MORELLIA still very, very strong and very, very heavily played. Mana cost, as we can see, hasn't really changed. We always talk about mana cost between sort of 3 and 4.5 as a general sort of rule. Right, let's have a look at master popularity in 2v2 randoms. So, as we can see, last season, APEP was hugely dominant, but is no more. Massive reduction, 20% reduction in APEP play rate, again possibly because of, well, primarily because of the bugs, but of course that was hotfix, but it doesn't seem to have come back. MORELLIA, there we see the #1 master, nearly 30% MORELLIA being played in 2v2 randoms, but as we'll see in a little bit, the kind of MORELLIA decks that we've seen in the past, maybe not the sort of decks that we're seeing currently. Historically, MORELLIA decks have always sort of had a very high percentage of accursed decks, but that doesn't seem to be quite the case anymore. We have had numerous accursed nerfs going forward. Stormbringer, decent uptick there, plus sort of 8-9%, and VOLCO is there again. So again, MORELLIA kind of dominating the board, and again, APEP dropping off, and again, mana costs not really changing. Right, let's round out the master popularity with our pre-mades. And again, Stormbringer is dominating the pre-mades leaderboard, if you like, from regards of the master choice. But a big increase to VOLCO yet again. We've seen that a lot as we're going through. And again, APEP dropping off quite substantially. And this time there was no increase in APEP play rate after the hotfix. So very surprising to see him not sort of recover after the hotfix was put out there. So, Stormbringer and VOLCO dominating there. And again, the mana cost has gone up a little bit, but we're still around the sort of levels that we expect. Okay, let's have a look at our rarity composition. We haven't seen much change in this over the meta videos, but this is probably the most change we've seen. Again, most of the decks primarily common cards, but this time we've seen a shift. Less common cards, more rare cards. And that's primarily because of things like the Stint and the Bounceberry Flingers. Stint getting nerfed, Bounceberry Flingers getting buffed. Also things like the Squire Puff, Shroom Puff, Bannerman, all rare cards, all seeing a lot more play. And of course, again, that's because of the Shroomama Shoomy meta. But again, if you're a new player, take a quick look. You don't need a deck full of Legendaries. It's not going to work out for you. You can see here that generally the decks have majority of common cards, and then they're built from the rest of Rare, Supreme, and of course, some Legendaries. Right, next up, faction composition. Again, we've got our graphs for all three modes, 1v1, 2v2 randoms, 2v2 premades, and of course the previous graphs underneath from last season. I know that the lettering is tiny, but the colours are quite, I think, obvious, and hopefully we can follow it along. So let's have a look. We can see Voidborn still dominating solos. I think that's a lot to do with Korgath, but the Zenshi has had a huge uptick. That's the bright green. Lots more Zenshi cards, and of course that's because of things like the Shroomama Shoomy, and also just general sort of Zenshi play. We've seen a lot of the Battle Shihao as well, so those increases there. And of course, going back to what we mentioned before, the Stint generally in a lot of decks being replaced by the Bounceberry Flingers. That's definitely going to be adding to the Zenshi numbers there. Okay, so let's have a look at 2v2 randoms, dominated by the Outlander cards. Previously, last season, it was the Scrat cards, then Voidborn and Outlander. Now it's Outlander, Scrat, and Voidborn. And again, an uptick in Zenshi. And 2v2 pre-made, Zenshi dominating there. A huge uptick. We can see Outlander dropping down to third place and Voidborn still there or thereabouts. And a healthy amount of Scrats. So interesting that the different factions are represented differently in the different modes. Always interesting to see. Right, next up, we're going to look at the wildcard usage. Of course, no wildcards in solos. Why do I include that just completely pointless graph there? I don't know. It just seems that it has to be there for completion's sake. Right, so let's have a look. Randoms, wildcards. No wildcards, 66%. Previously, it was about the same, so not too much has changed there. Yeah, so I do like to see that seems like a majority of decks do not have wildcards. Always good to see. We don't, personally, I don't like wildcards. I don't think they help the game, and I think they're just a crux for lesser skilled players. I've said it. Don't hate me. But what were being wildcarded the most? In randoms, we saw lots of Elite Swarmers, Aimbots, Crystal Archers, and of course, Shroomama Shoomies being wildcarded. And in pre-mades, Crystal Archers again, Shroomama Shoomy again, Suicrat, and, as mentioned previously, the Battle Shihao. Right, so that's the wildcards covered. Now let's have a look at the top cards. If you're thinking about building a deck and you want to know what are cards that are good, what are cards that are being played a lot, when we look at the leaderboards, this is going to help you for sure. Now, this has changed a little bit in format from the last time, so just hopefully it should be quite self-explanatory. So these are top cards, non-spells. So that's anything that's not a spell, okay? So just basically a minion or a building. Now, if it's got a green border, its rank has gone up from last season. If it's red, it's gone down. If it's white, it's a new card. And if it's black, it's the same. And the number in the corner of the card is its position last time. So let's dive straight into the 1v1. The number 1 card was the Bounceberry Flingers. And you can see that was number 86 in the list of most played cards last season. Now it's number 1. Remember, it did get changed. You only get one of them now. It does have the Growth Burst Shroom. There's no Myriad bonus. So it did get changed, and its play rate has skyrocketed. Especially that the fact that it goes so well with the Shroomama Shoomies as well, giving you that Growth Burst Shroom to give them an easy split. So, Shroom Shumi has been played hugely more this season than it was last season, according to the leaderboards. 88 times more this season than last season. That amount dropped significantly after the hotfix. So 88 times more than last season, and then 40 more times than last season after the hotfix. Same with the Bounceberry Flingers, 19 times more than last season. Basically, Flingers were played last season somewhat, a little amount. And then their play rate dropped down to 10 times after the hotfix. So still way more of those cards than last season. So we can see Shroom Shumi, the 9th top played card in 1v1. It was the 27th top played card in randoms and the 15th in pre-made. So maybe not quite as high up there as some people would think. Now remember, we're only looking at the leaderboard data here. So lower down in the ranks, this may or may not be representative of that. But this is the data that we have, and this is the conclusions that we can draw with. Now, interestingly, before the hotfix, Shroom Shumi was 3rd in the 1v1 cards played, dropped down there to 9th, but it was 33rd in randoms, which is lower than it was after the hotfix, and pre-mades it was 31st, way lower than 15th that it is now. So although they got nerfed in the hotfix, people did play more of them. And I think there's some things to consider with things like this, that kind of meta. It's kind of a snowball meta where early season, some people play them and they're very, very strong. And then the more they play them, the more they steamroll other people with them. And then those people that got steamrolled then decide, let's play this instead because it was very strong. And then it kind of explodes. And then not only do we get the explosion of people playing that meta, but we also get the explosion of people playing against that meta. And we'll see some cards in that. So for example, we see in the 1v1 top cards, the Battle Shihao. That's a great card to deal with multi-units. Again, we see the Battle Shihao in pre-mades. And Fergus, we see Fergus Flagoon Fighter. Also there in the 2v2 randoms, he is a great card to deal with the Shrooms as well. And just one thing to mention, a lot of people have been talking about how strong the Battle Shihao is. He's been played 1.6 times more this season than last season. So a huge uptick in the Battle Monkey, as we like to call him. And one thing somebody mentioned to me the other day, I pointed out, is the Battle Monkey gets a buff based on the number of enemies around him. But he gets a buff even if there's only one enemy. It seems like it should be... It kind of makes sense that it's a buff for every enemy over one, right? Just one enemy should be like base stats, 2 is a buff and so forth. But he doesn't. He gets buffed even with 1. So that's kind of strange. Okay, so those are the top non-spell cards. If you're looking for some good, solid cards to put in your deck to build around, then these will definitely give you a good starting spot. Right, next up, let's have a look at the spells. Now, one thing to notice is we see here the Rapid Response Reserves. That is a new card, and that is in the top 9 of all of the game modes. So remember, that's the card that it costs you 2 mana. It gives you arguably 6 mana's worth of stuff. Marines, Drone Buzzers, or the Siege Breaker. But of course it reduces the cost of your opponent's card by 4 as well. So kind of an overall cost of 6. So interesting to see that new card there. There's been a lot of discussion about how strong that is. Right, solos, we still see Morgrul's Mark as the most played card. But again, we can see a lot of cards that are probably being played because of either the General Zenshi or the specific Shroom Shumi meta. So we've got the Rampage, we've got the Shen's Shock Stick, we've got the Spirits, and so on and so forth. So 1v1's definitely very heavily influenced by the Shroom. Morgrul's Mark is still a very strong card, a very heavily played card, but it's only being played about half as often as it was before. Previously, when it first came out, it was everywhere. Its play rate was so far and above everything else, it was crazy. Now it's dropping down, but still a very strong and decently played card. Right, so if you're looking for some spells, there are some good ones for you. And of course, we've got a lot of big clear spells like the Beam of Doom, the Rimmergul's Breath, for example, to help clear with the big shrooms. And the Black Hole coming back. Potentially that is again because of the shrooms. You know, they are very susceptible to things like Beam of Doom if they're all clumped together, but not if you have a black hole. So, whilst I don't think the shrooms have defined the meta, I think they are really affecting the meta in many different ways. Right. Next up, top legendaries. New players are always asking, which legendary shall I build? What shall I craft first? I'm desperate to spend my stuff, which is the legendary that I should choose. Well, lots of good ones here. One thing to note is some of the legendaries are very, very specific and they're only going to work in certain kinds of decks. So think about Shroomamashumi. It's a card that defines your deck, where we got things like Jolo that's going to work in kind of any deck. So what I suggest, if you're crafting, I keep saying building, but if you're going to craft a legendary, maybe think about crafting one that's more generically used, so you can get a lot of use out of it. Right, so as you can see there, the top legendary, Shroomamashumi in solos, but also some cards that are used against it, so like Fergus, for example. Nice to see Prime Sergeant Radic being represented in all of these leaderboards, so that's we've seen both of the new cards appearing where appropriate, so that's good to see. Fergus, as mentioned, a very good counter to the shrooms and a lot of other stuff. He's being played 2.5 times more than he was last season, so hugely played this season for Fergus. We can see him on all of the leaderboards. Mountain Shaper was played 1.5 times more than it was last season. Not in the top 9 here, but worth mentioning, just a big clear spell again, probably because of the shrooms. And whilst Fergus is playing a lot more, Scotty is being played a lot less. Scotty was a very, very strong legendary, still is, but I don't think the meta suits him quite so much anymore. So he's being played about half as much as he was previously, as well as Zip Zapinator. Zip Zapinator last season was one of the strongest and most played legendaries, but now it's not so much. Again, dropping down to about half the play rate as we saw before. Doesn't mean it's bad, just means, especially with Zip, it did get a bit of a nerf, remember, with regards to a 2-second cooldown on the More Zap ability. So that's probably part of the reason, but maybe the meta just not suiting it quite so much. Okay, so that should give you a good idea of the legendaries. Now, we're going to go into a new section that we hadn't had before. Now, please let me know in the comments if you like this edition, because it did take quite a lot of time to add, and it does have its limitations, but I think it does have its uses as well. Now, before I go into that, it would be remiss of me to thank Chuck Cannon on YouTube, who actually suggested this. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the top cards, but instead of just looking at the top cards generically, we're going to look at which cards are played most with the specific masters. So if you're building a deck with APEP, this gives you a good idea. So let's dive in. So here we see APEP, top cards. Again, solo randoms and pre-mades. Now you will note there's a little, in the corner, in the top right of each corner, there is a number of how many decks were used to give us an idea of these cards. Now, I thought it was important to include that because there's some masters that are very, very lowly played compared to other masters. And of course, if we're only looking at a few decks, then it's not going to give us a particularly representative example. So I thought it was important to include that there, so use that information as you will. Okay, so Elite Swarmer, top card in 1v1. We can see Future Present used a lot with APEP, but interestingly, Future Past not there. Nothing particularly stands out too much. We see the Battle Monkey again there. Oh, and one thing to mention, if there is a little dash instead of the number, that just means it wasn't played last season in the data that we had. 2v2 randoms. Again, we see the Elite Swarmer in there in the stint, both dropping out a little bit. They did get nerfs in the latest patch, so not shocking there. And then we could see things like the Cleaver, we're not shocked to see him. Defenso Chopper, and really just cheap sort of control cards with some heavy spells where required. Okay, so those are the top cards for APEP. Remember, you can just pause the video, print the screen, whatever you want to do if you want to take longer to have a look at this data. Now, again, let's have a look at DIONA. So, nothing particularly out of the ordinary. Elite Swarmer dropping down. Again, the stint as well. Aimbot getting a lot of play. That's one of the very strong cards this season for sure. And again, looking at the 2v2 randoms. Grenadier being very heavily played compared to what it was previously. But here, just let me mention again, for example, with the 2v2 randoms, you can see we've only got 12 decks that we looked at. So not a huge data set to cover there. But the Grenadier, a cheap source of AoE, which is always going to be useful against things like loads of little shrooms. And the 2v2 premates, interesting to see the Rammer as the #1 card. And the support with things like the Dragon Ball gives you an idea that that's the sort of thing, the very aggro deck. And of course, one of the reasons for that is DIONA's traps are a real good way to support this face push. Right, next up we have King Puff, and this is a master that is pretty underplayed at the moment, so very few decks that were used. So whilst we can get a little bit of data from it, it's not going to be hugely indicative of the meta as an entirety. But as we would expect, we see a lot of split minions, like the Horde, the Skeleton Horde, the Prop Horde there, for example. Azali's there. I think I contributed towards that Azali stat. And of course, we see the Bounce Breach Flingers, as we will kind of almost everywhere. Right, so King Puff top cards, if you look in there. Next up, we have MILLOWEEN. So MILLOWEEN, I think MILLOWEEN is still decent, but she's... I feel like people are just very reticent to play her after there was that big change to the Arcane Golem where it couldn't hit air. And I think it's just a lot more difficult to play her now than before, and people have just said, that's too much hard work. Let's not go with that. So again, MILLOWEEN, as we would expect, lots of spells. Kurnath Crystalback in there. Seems like one of the very few ways that you can play, because it does give you that support to deal with the air, and of course Unholy Ground in there as well to help with things like that. Okay, so there's some MILLOWEEN cards if you're looking to build a MILLOWEEN deck. Next up we have MORDAR. Now we can see the 1v1 MORDAR seems to be very heavily Shroomer Shumi defined. It's almost an entire deck there. But 2v2 randoms, it's way more stout hearts. So we've got Fergus, we've got Urclaw, we've got Bolt, Bolf, that's it, nailed it. And some support spells as well. And then when we go to the 2v2 premades, you can see that we're kind of moving more to the Ritual decks. You can see the Ritual is the most played card in MORDAR for 2v2. And just some extra information, if we look at the average mana for these decks, the average mana for MORDAR 1v1 was 3.5, for 2v2 randoms was 4.9, and for 2v2 premates was 5.6, which kind of tracks with what we're seeing here. Right, next up, MORELLIA. Now, MORELLIA, I think, in solos is quite swayed by Korgoth. So not only do we have Korgoth, we have a lot of Voidborn cards in there as well. So I think MORELLIA and Korgoth is very, very strong. You get the potential Spirit from the spellbook to drop on Korgoth, and you get the perk 3 Dragon Stroke Korgoth push, which can be really, really difficult to deal with. Now, 2v2 randoms, we can see there's still some Accursed cards in there, but a lot of the Accursed cards dropping down, and I think Accursed is, especially because it's had some nerfs recently, Accursed is dropping out of favour a little bit with regards to playing MORELLIA. And we can see, if we look at 2v2 premades, there's no Accursed cards there at all. So Accursed MORELLIA in randoms, but not as much as before, and not really that much at all in 2v2. So for example, last season in pre-mades, the #1 card for Morellia was Nive's Breath. This season, it was the 51st card. So I think Nive's Breath is a real indicative card of the play rate when it comes to Cursed Ascension decks. Right, there's Morellia. Next up we have Wrecked, R3KT, as FDM would say. Remember, Wrecked does get a bonus from the heavier minions, so we see a lot of those. But one thing to note here, outside of solos, very, very few Wrecked decks, so can't really take too much from that. Wrecked is definitely a strong master in 1v1, but not very good in 2v2s. Sometimes we just have masters like that. It's difficult to balance things in all of the game modes. Right, so there's Wrecked, and coming up next, it's RATBO. Again, not a particularly heavily played master, but a decent number of decks to give us a decent idea of what's going on. And there we see again a couple of aimbots in the top 9. That's a very strong card. And generally, if you're playing aimbot, you're going to be wanting to play some other Outlander cards to give you that tech, so you can get your marksmanship and get those pesky little gnats. So I think I was a little surprised we didn't see so many scrats in this data, but it is what it is. Right, next up, Ravager. Top cards of Ravager. And we can see 1v1 is kind of a combination of either playing Shrumama Shumi decks or playing Voidborn aggro decks. But I think across the board, a lot of Zenshi cards, a lot of cards that are going to really benefit from the haste, from the perk 2 from Ravager, and also to help you do the big pushes. But we can see Shrumama Shumi featuring decently heavily all around there. Right, next up, SETTSU. So Bridge Buddies is the #1 card in all 3 game modes for SETTSU. So if you're building a SETTSU deck, you pretty much just want to put that in there. And maybe just put Morgrul's Mark in there as well. Not a huge amount of decks, especially in solos. We've got 12 decks there. Kind of weird to see Mardred in there, but when we don't have many decks, then just 1 or 2 players kind of decks that may or may not sort of line up with the general meta that we'd expect can really affect the outcome of that. But that's the data we have, and those are the conclusions that we can draw from it. So again, lots of spells as you would expect, and the bounce brief flingers there just all over the place as well. Right, next up, Stormbringer. As you would generally expect, Stormbringer has a lot of ranged units. So we got a lot of Crystal Elves, as well as a lot of Outlander units. Not particularly shocking. Nothing particularly stands out as particularly weird. So it's always nice when the data kind of backs up what you kind of expect it to show. Next up we have VALORIAN. Now one thing to mention is VALORIAN was supposed to be changed from a cycle-based master to a timer-based master in the last patch. It was even included in the patch notes, but for some reason that change didn't go through. So he's still cycle-based, which means his effectiveness from his perk 1, the Searing Light, goes down as your mana cost goes up, your average mana cost goes up. But again, we see, as kind of expected, a lot of Empyrean cards in there, even though he doesn't necessarily have that direct Empyrean synergy that he once had. It still seems to be the kind of thing, because there's a lot of Empyrean units are quite decently tanky, and they respond well to the heals that he can dish out. Right, so those are the VALORIAN. Not too many VALORIANs, especially outside of 1v1 again. And now we look at VOLCO. So again, VOLCO, as we mentioned, a lot more VOLCO and a lot more Shrumama Shumi, and a lot more VOLCO and Shrumama Shumi. We see Shrumama as the 4th place card in 1v1 and in 2v2, Not quite on there for pre-mades, but it was 12th in pre-mades, so pretty much up there. So very meta-defining, I think, for Volco with regards to Shroomarmor, Shroomy, and of course the buffs that go with it. The Bannerman's seen a lot more play. The Squire Puff's seen a lot more play. The Shroom Puff's seen a lot more play. The Spirits have seen a lot more play. So really sort of defining the meta, or at least the partial meta definition, especially when it comes to certain masters. Okay, so that is it. That is our Minion Masters meta review. For 1.49. Let me know in the comments what you thought, especially with regards to when we're looking at the Masters card specifics that we did at the end. Is this increased information useful to you? Is it something you want me to continue to do in the future? Because it is kind of a lot of work to put all this extra stuff in there. But hopefully it's useful to you. Let me know in the comments. Also, of course, let me know in the comments if you agree with the general meta. If you are surprised at anything. If you think anything was missed. And as mentioned, of course, we are looking at the leaderboard data. So players that are not quite up to the leaderboard level, lower down, they may be experiencing a different meta. Different cards that are better or worse than what we're experiencing on the leaderboard. So again, let me know if you're experiencing anything different. And of course, if you're enjoying the content here in the Fish Tank and you want to make sure you don't miss out on anything Minion Masters related, make sure you hit that subscribe button. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like. Let me know in the comments how your day's going. And I think that's pretty much it. Hopefully this didn't go for too long. We covered a lot. And as mentioned, of course, go back, revisit it, pause it, screenshot it, whatever you want to do. Get the best use you can out of the data. I'm Bad as a Fish. And as always, I'm Awkward Waving. What is this?